We'll hit record. Okay. So what I was thinking for today, and this is completely open for discussion, but I put down a couple agenda items in the notes. So what I was kind of thinking is like looking again at the roles that we've defined near the bottom of the document and sort of confirm if these are kind of the right roles that we want to have defined right now. Choose basically if we're going to do a steering council, which it sounded like we're kind of leaning that way, how many people are on that? And then start to talk a little bit about process for filling those roles. So I don't think we have to kind of have like, you know, all the things figured out about sort of going forward, what like is a steering council election look like, those sorts of things. I think the first sorts of sets are like, what are the roles we want to have defined? How do we do this first step of filling those roles? And then assuming that we can get those roles filled, then we will figure out how to like do some things going forward. But we might want to like agree upon a couple of things, like how often do we want to review and change roles? Like, do we want to do that every year, every 6 months? Because I think it's important to have like something in mind as to kind of when we take a step back and reevaluate and change things up. You know, having a cadence for change is a healthy thing. So if we want to sort of define what that time period or time window looks like, we can do that. Does that seem like a reasonable set of goals for this meeting? Are there other things that you think we should be sure to address? Excellent. Cool. Okay, then let's start by taking a look again at the roles we've defined. One other thing I just wanted to note is that with the finances side of things, I did go in and jot down how much things are costing and oh yeah, who is paying for things, and Rowan is paying for more things than he should be. So we can also chat about how we want to figure that out and like distribute and make some of those decisions. Cool. I'm just going to share my screen so that we can all kind of be looking at the same thing. Perfect. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so where I think we kind of want to start is, so I guess first question, it seemed like last time we were basically settling on the like decision-making backstop being a steering council as opposed to a BDFL model. Does that sound like, does anyone have concerns or further thoughts on that?
I think as long as like someone wants to be a BDFL, I think that steering council idea seems better. If there's a strong person who wants to be, I guess we can vote maybe.
You don't want to be the BDFL, Sagi?
No, not at all.
Fair enough. Okay, so with the steering council, okay, so let me I'll share kind of what I'm thinking on this, and then we'll open it up for more discussion. So the model that I kind of had in mind after kind of reflecting on this from last week is we've got sort of a number of roles here that are defined. And what I kind of was thinking is that like we sort of basically separate the ideas of like what is the SimPEG organization, similar to how like any nonprofit or a business would function, which has a managing director, director of operations, and in this case, like sort of core contributors, perhaps with domain lead labels. As well as this idea that Devin raised about a community liaison, somebody who like is kind of this point person for making sure questions are answered. So having sort of these hats be given out to individuals, and then having basically a steering council of 3 or 5 people who are elected, and they can be elected from that body, but they don't have to be. But like there should be some sort of nomination and voting process. But I don't think that we should necessarily have like the director of operations is de facto on the steering council, or the managing director is de facto on the steering council. I think that we want to tease those two things apart. Does that sound reasonable?
But so if something is up for vote, it would include the steering council and the directors?
Like what do you...
I don't know. I'm just wondering then, yeah, if they're not in the steering council, how do they work together?
Okay, so what I think could work here is like, I don't think that I suspect that they could end up being on the steering council, and I think that that's potentially fine. But I just think that like those hats are given out independently. Does that make sense? And then like with respect to sort of decision making and I guess the scope of the steering council, I think something along the lines like, you know, Dieter, what you shared with the scikit or the SciPy governance with the way that a BDFL operates, like they shouldn't really be doing sort of the day-to-day decision making. It should be much more sort of consensus building and things like that. But when there does need to be a decision made, if that consensus building fails is one example, that is when the steering council steps in and like is the authority there. I think also for things that like just, you know, sometimes there just does need to be a decision on behalf of SimPEG. So for example, the financing side of things, like SimPEG needs to decide how we're going to figure that out. And so in this case, then I would see like the steering council perhaps being the ones who like vote and are the people who have the authority to say this is where we're going. Does that fit? Do you think that
So like when you come to that point, so the board of directors is not involved in that decision making. Am I right? So it's only steering council who are going to decide.
So I think I'm actually going to delete this board of directors here, and I think it's just the steering council is effectively in a sense the same thing as a board of directors. The way a board of directors would operate with a company is so yeah. So the steering council are the ones who would be the ones sort of making those final decisions.
Do you have any thoughts on like you had the 3 question mark people plus 2 directors? Does that change when you delete the board of directors side of things, or?
Yeah, I think so. Is that this is maybe 3 to 5 people. We need an odd number.
Yeah, I guess my only thoughts on like the number is like, well, anyways, I think that like the smaller the better there, because I hope that the role of this is not involved in like day-to-day decisions, and it shouldn't be relied on to be that. So like all of the things are sort of acting as, well, I don't know, I'm not involved, so but like I feel like if that's small, then it's it might be better.
Seems like it's kind of taking on the role of like splitting up the BDFL into 3 people. So it's like they don't really have complete say, but it should still work towards it. At least that's what it seems like it would be intended towards. In which case, I think it'd probably be best not to have the directors on it.
So do we want that like to be an explicit, if you are a named director of, or like a named, I would suspect it's maybe these three, like the managing director, or just even these two, managing director and director of operations. Do we want to make it explicit that like these people cannot be on the steering council?
I find that weird. So you would have a managing director who's a bit responsible for direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you would have the steering council who could have a completely different opinion.
Yeah, I feel like, well, I don't know, pulling on companies and that sort of thing is often the CEO is on the board.
Yeah.
And that works well because you have those high level decisions that you have a vote on, but then you're like, know how to actually steer and manage and get it done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So at that point, then it's basically, are these people that we're envisioning being on this for longer periods of time? So I could imagine these, like the director's role might change a little bit quicker than some of these, or it's possible that it would. I'm just not quite sure. I'm just kind of curious as to the like lifespan of some of these roles.
Yeah. So let's maybe pose the question. Joe, if you were on the steering council, how often would you want sort of that to be evaluated for you to be able to say like, hey, I did my service, I would like to move on to other things?
We could make it more like a rotating thing where it's like you're on it for a few years and then it's like staggered with a new person coming on possibly.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I could see like, okay, yeah, the director, I could see at least one of the directors being on it and then rotating other people. If they want, because that kind of works as far as it kind of happens at like editor level of journals as well. Maybe, I would say maybe like a 2-year kind of thing, possibly. I'm just throwing out a number.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's helpful to just like, let's put it down and then let's see what are other reactions to Joe's comments there?
Yeah. I feel like, Lindsay, you said 6 months as well, like early on, and I feel like that's way too fast a cadence.
Yeah. Yep, I would agree there, is that you want to have some time for some stability, and a year might even be too short for that too. Like, I don't know, 2021. So
if it's like, yeah, if it's at least 2 years and it's like, okay, well, one of the directors and say 2 other people on it, that at least rotates one person off a year.
Mm-hmm.
If there you have splitting the BDFL role, and the BDFL role usually is a role for 10 years or longer, and usually works either the one who is in that charge doesn't want anymore, or someone else has the impression that it should be a change, and that should be, and I think that is good if it could be either self stepping down or someone thinks that someone should step down, and in that case you would just need a process so it can be done anonymously.
Mhm.
So it's not kind of you're afraid of saying like, I think this person should step down, which goes along the code of conduct and how we can address problems anyway.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like Joe's idea of like you replace one person per year. And I'm just thinking to like most associations, they do like a general assembly once a year. So if we do the general assembly, that could be also the occasion for voting for that single person every year. Just a thought.
And I don't imagine any reason why, if that person still wanted to keep doing it, that we would like, okay, no, you can't keep doing it. But at least it's a mechanism for that to happen if somebody wants to do that.
I quite like that. I quite like that is I think because one of the things that I think is a bit dangerous about sort of not having like a checkpoint to just reevaluate and ask, do you still want to do this or not? It can be easy for folks to like continue staying on just because you feel responsible. I mean, you've seen sort of the BDFL burnout, and so we don't want to like set up, instead of one person, we don't want to set up 3 people to be in that same scenario. But if folks are willing and excited to sort of, you know, keep some consistency there, I don't think there's any problem with having somebody on for longer.
Do we have like a bit of imagination what what would the steering council would decide? Like I cannot like at this point it's hard to imagine what kind of like problem would face and what these people would decide. Do we have like an example?
Yeah, Rowan just put one down, which I think is a good question, is like, do we pay for Slack and how are we going to pay for that? Also things, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just if it, I don't think it happened yet, but if there is a PR and there is a debate for half a year or a year and it's like halfway pro con to include something or not, someone has eventually to make the decision if something should land in master, right? I think that's.
Yeah, that's a good
Which
point.
becomes more likely the bigger the community is, because then interests become more varied.
Mm-hmm. I think too, and Rowan, I'll let you jump in. Hey, Liz.
What?
Welcome to Canada.
Oh, hi. Sorry. I thought you were trying to show me something to read.
No.
Oh, hi. He's like angling his computer so it's got like text up. And I'm like, what do you want me to read? I can't read it. Anyway, hi. Okay, goodbye.
Lucky smile.
Which was clearly never cleaned before we got it. Not OCD, it's fine.
Yeah, Rowan, do you want to speak to either of those points?
Which ones? Yeah, I think some of the finance pieces are probably get elevated to there, is and sort of like making some of those decisions that will help benefit the community, but do come with like getting grants or paying for this out of existing finances. I think it's like the high level admin work to actually make this a little bit more of an organization. So where do the code of conduct violations go? I think they should go up to the steering council. And so if there's named people on that, then that's where they go, so that there's no ambiguity there. And then I think there's also been, at least when I was talking with Lindsay back in the summer, some of the impetus to start this conversation were interest from more commercial organizations, and like what is the mechanisms to have point people to start some of those conversations and feel like there's something on the other side of those conversations. So I think it's, yeah, coordination and administration and those sorts of things, which help create a little bit of structure around the SimPEG community.
Right.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important question: who is responsible for the code of conduct, and if it is the steering council, and there should probably be two person kind of responsible, because you should act fast. I don't know if you heard all of I think it was Jupiter Con that had a pretty bad example recently, and yeah, we should learn from that and avoid things like this. And it should have at least two. What we see in Swang is we should have at least two person responsible for conduct, and probably one male and one female. Because
that sounds very good.
Yeah, just we had all these discussions just a couple of weeks ago over in Swang.
Yeah, we should include more female in our group. It's Lindsay's too long, I guess.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, one of the things that I just added here too, well, two, I guess. So picking up on Rowan's point about if there is commercial interest, or even grants, like I think that, sort of thinking through if we're gonna put in funding that like there is something dedicated to SimPEG. I don't think the steering council needs to be necessarily the one to sign off on that. Like if Zoggy wants to put in a grant, or Dieter wants to put in a grant to get something done, you don't need permission. But I think that the steering council has a role to play there with just like, it would be great if you were willing to send that to the steering council so that they can kind of, help coordinate and help sort of force multiply efforts, so that, we can make efficient use of resources as they come in.
Is it actually possible, Lindsay? Let's say if I write a grant, and can I set up money to support like open source development? Because like that provides the tools and like environment to develop proceed this research. Is that kind of possible?
So right now, the way to do something like that, and I think this is an important question that we should look into and revisit. Right now, the way to do that would be to like bring in, if you get that grant and you have somebody who is a postdoc working with you or grad student working with you, allocate some of their time, which is paid for from that grant, to be doing that. But we don't actually currently have like a mechanism to, if you just want to pay money to SimPEG to have something done, that doesn't exist. And we don't have sort of either the legal, well, we don't have the legal mechanisms to do that at the moment. But then there's also sort of the like personnel who would get paid to do that. And so I think it's a good question, and we should ask like if that is something that we want to be able to do, start to structure kind of what that looks like. But I think though, even in this interim stage where we don't necessarily have that organization, even if like Zoggy, you were to get a grant and you have 50,000 set aside to do some SimPEG work, and there's somebody somewhere else in the SimPEG community who would be the perfect fit for that job. Like I think the steering council has a role to play in just kind of helping draw those lines of connection. And then I guess one of the other things I put down is like granting admin status on things, knowing who is an admin on the things, is that right now that is actually a little fragmented. I mean, it's fine because we're still a small enough group that you know, and we're in touch day to day on things. But, you know, as things grow, it's important that, you know, somebody has an eye on these things and is responsible for keeping an eye on these things. Cool. Right. I want to just give anyone else a chance who's been quieter. If there's thoughts, if you think we're completely off base, if you think this makes sense, feel free to jump in.
Well, I just wanted to, kind of step in on the finances, which I think is something that should be thought of sooner rather than later, because, you know, we've already had a couple of cases where, you know, there is potentially money that could be coming into the SimPEG community, but, you know, with the structure of the organization, just trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we do this? And what's our long-term goal in this? Because, I mean, ultimately it's, you know, it's sustainability that's going to be required. We're going to need some money. There's avenues out there that we can probably do this, but we need to have kind of that right organizational status and a protocol and a mechanism by which, you know, we can kind of do this seamlessly. So I just view that as being now, you know, an important part of how we try to set this up, and especially the steering committee and all it's part of the governance.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, do people envision that, you know, SimPEG structure would actually employ people? I mean, what about the other groups out there? Are they do they actually have, you know, full-time whatever employees that are somehow being paid by, I don't know, monthly contributions to whatever they're doing? Or I don't know.
So
yeah,
go ahead, Saki.
No, yeah, I wasn't sure. What I was imagining was a little bit different route, rather than like employing by SimPEG itself. But there's other like a kind of more front end project, like groundwater imaging, for instance, let's say Central Valley of California, and then figure out like a kind of good connection point that can kind of feed back into SimPEG and pay for him. Yeah, that's like what I was generally thinking. I wasn't sure directly employing with SimPEG. I wasn't sure how that could work out.
Because I mean, at this time, we've got people on payrolls whose primary responsibility is to, you know, develop SimPEG, and they're, you know, trying to make sure that they do other things that benefits their career. But for instance, all the things that Devin is doing, you know, with respect to SimPEG, I mean, that is being paid for. I mean, it's being paid for out of a different grant. But if that different grant didn't exist, then how's that documentation going to be done? And to some extent, the same is true with Joe, even though, you know, we're hoping that Joe is going to get some scientific papers out of here and then move on and be, you know, a professor someplace. But the reality is he's basically a SimPEG postdoc, but that money is not coming from SimPEG. So it's like, I mean, maybe we can kind of keep mustering along so that, you know, we've got enough sort of donations from the community at large and enough people in-house that are somehow being funded from someplace else to continue to, develop SimPEG, but it's a little bit of a risky thing and actually needs to be thought of, I think, quite carefully.
Mhm.
So I just go from what I understand about the NumPy structure is that there's basically a level above NumPy. It's this Num focus group, and they're the ones that handle all of the income, and like that's where they direct people to for donations, sponsorships. And I believe they employ a few people to help administer all of this actually.
Mhm.
That's how kind of how their structure is set up. It's like they funnel all the money towards this, and that's who distributes it. And uses it to support the NumPy PyData community.
But then Num Focus is huge. There are dozens of projects and probably thousands of developers. So it's probably a very different size than SimPEG.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's also, yeah, thanks, Ron. Being based in the US, I don't know if sort of it would necessarily serve or be the right fit for the SimPEG community, because it is an international group. I mean, with a core in Canada, but like, having a fiscal sponsor in the US, round tripping money from Canadian dollars to US dollars and back would not be ideal, and is probably more structure than what we want.
Just like one other point on the structuring side is like there are a lot of tax ways to do this and grants that are available if there is an organization around it that help with that sort of like bootstrapping style sustainability piece that Doug was talking about. Is if there is some of that money coming in, there are tax pieces that like 60+% can come back into the organization the next year. And so it doesn't actually have to be a huge amount to actually get something going.
So does the steering council want to start a nonprofit?
So if you're a nonprofit, so is it possible, let's say, to something like the question that I asked, like, okay, we're putting up a proposal or grant, and then actually assigning some money to support that organization, and with the good reasoning, that's possible?
That then becomes possible, yes. Is because then you can either like co-apply, or you can sub-award to a SimPEG organization.
I see.
Well, I don't know. This was a lot of the conversation that Lindsay and I were having, I don't know, years ago even. Yeah. Which a big part of it is, are there people who in our community who want different like career paths that are adjacent to academia and still in research, still in tight communication with those, but maybe not necessarily in the university, but still working on grants and geophysical research and that sort of thing. So I think there's like, do we want that as a community?
So Rowan, I mean, that's exactly my situation. I mean, I'm not at a university. I'm at a government, research organization, and about half of my time is kind of devoted to research, like my own research interests, and I do other stuff in the other times. So yeah, I think there's definitely a bunch of people in that camp who are not just kind of academic researchers at universities, but who have a more applied focus and view things like SimPEG as a primary tool for their work.
That's exactly where I'm coming from too. Like DS employs me, but we have those shred credit where I can't remember what exactly it is, but it's pretty much a government grant to like pays for my wage to do research and other things for them, like applied stuff.
Yeah, that was the 60% tax credit. It's actually 64% tax credit that you get back of any revenue coming into a company in that case. The government refunds in Canada, that is 60% of that. And so that's why a lot of companies can do this sort of research.
And yeah, obviously Mira does the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, like in New Zealand, my funding, I probably have about half of my funding come from core government grants, and then the rest of it is from either competitive awards that I apply for, or what we call commercial work, such as consulting for external companies and other organizations, or other government agencies that require us to do work that we charge them for.
But do you fork money outside of your organization, Craig, or it's just basically resources for your time?
How do you mean? Do I?
Well, for instance, like private companies in Canada with the shred, they can basically offset taxes through this, right? But it's not free money that they can just move around to somewhere else, like in other organizations. Can you have funding that? Can you fund basically outside organizations?
We could through a subcontract. So I mean, if I wrote a $5 million research proposal and it got funded, and there were people from UBC on that proposal, then there would be a subcontract to UBC for whatever we're asking that contributor to do. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
So if it's written into a grant is that there'll be subcontracts to X, Y, and Z organizations, then yeah, sure, that happens all the time.
But could that be like a SimPEG organization, or is that actually a person that's written into that grant?
Yeah, I don't know. Typically, it's a professor or a person, and we'll fund some of that person's time, and we'll maybe fund a student or something like that to work on a project. But I think if it's an organization, that'd be more of a disbursement, like an expense, if you like, where we're kind of buying a piece of hardware almost, if you like. We're buying a service, or we're buying a license almost to use SimPEG software through supporting the organization. I'm not sure. It's probably a less common occurrence. I'm not sure if people are writing support to a critical piece of infrastructure into their grant. Yeah, if you viewed SimPEG as kind of an infrastructure, like a supercomputer, typically that infrastructure would be funded from elsewhere, so perhaps you wouldn't be expected to support it. But if it's an organization like SimPEG where it's not supported elsewhere, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's not so uncommon to have a line item in a budget for the use of a piece of software or something, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
But
yep.
Yeah, unfortunately, because SimPEG is totally in open source, they could make an argument like, why are we paying for this? So
yeah, it'd be like, why am I paying NumPy to use their open source software or something? It'd be interesting to see what other grants people do who write grants, whether they support open source software in that kind of way. And if they do, how they kind of phrase it in their what the line item in the budget is actually phrased as.
The industrial community is changing a little bit in their view, in the sense that they're now more willing to support research, even though the software will be made open source. We've seen that transition, which has actually been pretty amazing over the last 3 or 4 years. So yeah, there are changes being made in the system to recognize the value of open source, but whether one can capitalize on them and how you do that is still a pretty open question.
Mm.
That makes me wonder if sort of the, go ahead, Craig.
Oh no, sorry, I was just going to say, it sounds like we almost need some external advice from people who are used to people who have set up kind of non-for-profit organizations, multinational non-for-profit, to just explore if, tax implications, how it works for if people want to contribute that through grants or all those sorts of things, just to see what the different models are out there and implications of them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the role of steering committee.
Yeah.
Seems like a lot of work.
Well, it probably will be at the outset, but I mean, if we can somehow figure out something that works for people and that will help with the sustainability of all the SimPEG efforts, then that will be good to go. It's just the growing pains of trying to figure out what you want to be, how you're called, and how you want to structure yourself so that it kind of works.
And which country is best to actually base all that in? Because I imagine it could be quite different doing it in Canada versus doing it in the US versus doing it somewhere else.
Well, as we found out, even across provinces, doing an NGO in Canada is different than just being a BC organization, right? So just pick the best one.
But yeah, this might really be worth, and if once the steering council is there, have a talk with Matt Hall or the whole board of SWAN, because that's just the same we did half a year ago with SWAN in Canada, making an NGO and a bank account and have someone for the finances and see how that can work across the globe. Mm-hmm. And that's probably related to the lots of work of SOGI. I guess when you would go that route, you would have to pay someone who do the finance, for instance, and all that stuff, because that's absolutely not our expertise. Or so then it's a bit less work, but then it costs money. That comes the overhead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there'll undoubtedly be some cost involved with setting something up. But yeah, we'll have to deal with that somehow, I guess. Donations.
So there were a couple thoughts that struck me. So thinking through sort of this, like, what is the line item? And Doug, to your point about sort of the change in research, I mean, I think there's still, and I don't know if this is a piece that makes sense, but like, is thinking of this work in a sense like a technology transfer. Is that like, yes, it's one thing to get code into SimPEG that is open source and MIT licensed. It is a different thing to actually make that usable for others and have examples and have scripts and drivers and those sorts of things. I don't know if that's an easier way to frame that conversation.
Well, I think it is perhaps, and you know, Dom might have some comments on that because he's kind of pretty much in that space at this point. Is Dom here?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Yeah.
I think there's a limit at what we should expect SimPEG core to do, because a lot of those drivers are specific to to very niche applications, and even though if someone else would like to use them, they might have to live somewhere else, or someone else maintains them, and if it's the private sector that takes it over, then it's great. But I don't think SimPEG core should spend resources on that. It should just document what it has, like the core functionalities, optimize the core functionalities, and just let externals fork projects or build on top of it. Because otherwise you're going to be spending way too much resources, already thin resources, on like an infinite number of projects.
That's very fair, Dom. And perhaps thinking through what the scope of that is, because I think the term technology transfer in a sense can still sort of work, or maybe we need a different term for that. But I think there is perhaps a spectrum of like getting it to the stage where somebody external could actually pull together a notebook. Like, are the things well documented enough, and variable names thought through, and all of these sorts of things. But I guess that really does come back to sort of more the core maintenance and
our 5-year plan. Yeah. What's our plan?
Yeah.
What is the minimum that we want to be able to bring into scope and bring it to like usability?
Yep. Okay. So in terms of next steps, do we basically, okay, so there's a couple things I want to maybe think through. So it seems like the steering council of 3 people-ish is kind of like what we're coming to a bit of consensus on. Is that, do folks have any other concerns around that as kind of being like the decision-making entity? Okay.
I think it's good to start with 3, but if you write something down, like if it would become an NGO, you would have to find that somewhere, right? And then I would keep it open. It could be 3, 5, 7, but we start with 3, so it's not fixed.
That's really fair.
Because what we saw now, also to come back to Svang, if SimPEG goes really global, then you might want to consider taking into account different regions of the world. And then what we saw now, 3 would not be enough, because then if you're distributed around the world, you will have troubles to find times that fit everyone. So if you're more, then there's a bigger chance that you have a quorum to meet, and yeah, things like this.
That sounds good. Yes. So basically, sort of, we're starting with 3, but there's a mechanism to grow that. Do we want to chat? I know we're coming close to the hour, so I want to be respectful of that. I am able to stick around longer if folks want to continue. So thinking through the 3, do we want to also define these? Do these roles kind of fit with folks? Is there anything else you wanted to raise with these as kind of being the starting group. I mean, I think that to Dieter's point, like we can build this so there is room and space to add titles as needed. But is this a good like core set of hats people can wear when you talk about what you do in SimPEG?
Lindsay, sorry, I'm just probably a bit slow to the party. Can you just tell me which roles you're talking about? I'm just trying to find in the document. It's like the managing director, operations director.
Yeah. Core contributor.
Core contributor, right. Domain lead.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. If there's no comments, does anyone have thoughts, comments? This sort of works.
So you're looking at a steering council of 3 to 5 people, and those amongst which one of those people would be the managing director, one would be the director of operations, or are they separate roles outside of the steering council?
So I
think at least one. I think at least one of them should be. Both of them can if they choose, or if they're nominated and they want to take on that role. If one of them doesn't want to, I think they should at least be like a non-voting member. If it happens like that, this is like be part of the conversation. But if it comes to something needed to be voting on, then they would step out or something. So it's still an even number or an odd number of voting people. At least that was what I was thinking, or that came up. But
yep, I would be inclined, and feel free to disagree with me on this. I would be inclined to say that the like managing director is by default, or they should be on the steering council. In a sense, because that's kind of like, I'm just drawing a parallel with like, as Rowan mentioned, like a CEO is on a board. And in a sense, like I almost wonder if it would be better for the director of operations to be in a non-voting role in the case where there's a scenario where like there is a giant dispute of pull requests. It is in a sense the director of operations role to like enact that decision. And it would be unfortunate if they had to be both like having a strong disagreement with that and then enact that. I don't know if folks have opinions on that, or if that is like a level of complexity we don't need to really think through at this stage.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking through the example there's an example I'm thinking of where the GeoNet program in New Zealand, which is like the hazard monitoring program for the country, there's a steering group for that, which has got, I don't know, like half a dozen or so external people, mostly from stakeholder agencies, funding agencies, those sorts of things. But there are, the program director does sit on that steering group, and often like a more operational person does as well. So I think it would be sensible to have kind of the 2 higher level people as part of that group, or at least one of them, because it helps kind of, well, then it has to be communicated from a steering group to, you know, people who are actually potentially going to do the work or whatever's required. So it kind of makes sense, I think, if at least one of those people is directly on that. But in terms of voting rights or whatever, I don't know.
Could you say both can be on, but they have max 1 vote? So let's say the the managing director is in, but if he can't, the operational director can go in and they can agree on themselves who is there, who has to vote. They just have at the most one vote. I don't know if that is legally possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation is you don't want the steering group deciding a whole bunch of stuff in the absence of the people who are actually going to have to implement stuff work. I think there needs to be perhaps the opportunity for a pushback on like, actually, that's not realistic, or that's not SimPEG's role, that's another organization's role. Just to kind of balance that a little bit.
I kind of think as the role or as the like steering council grows, it'll be easier. So like as soon as it hits 5 people, then both of them would be on it. Like would be part of it. But as it starts smaller, I mean, I kind of like the idea of having other people input. And at that point, like, okay, both the directors on it with 3 people, that only leaves one other person to have an input.
Yeah.
So is it, maybe if it starts small, we kind of do like this, like it's just one director and the other person is on it, but not necessarily voting, but once it grows, then that person becomes a voting member, and then there's still more outside input, but they have more of a role.
I'm kind of wondering if 3 is a bit small.
Yeah.
And perhaps 5 would be better to kind of get a broader spectrum of people rather than just it becoming down to 2 people's ideas, which may be biased in certain directions or something.
I guess if you had 5, it would also let people abstain if they weren't involved in that particular aspect of the project.
Yeah.
There's kind of 2 thoughts that come to mind. One is like, I'm wondering if like even kind of thinking through, okay, if we're going to create a nonprofit organization, I actually don't think that this is entirely on the steering council. Like perhaps thinking more so of like a working group type model is that, you know, we can create a working group of people who are interested in helping create an organization. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to be all on the steering council. It's people who want to have input and help craft this. Because I think like we want to sort of separate basically, just because a group is sort of responsible for decision making doesn't mean that they're like responsible for like carrying everything. Is that we want to make sure that I think we still get input and ideas and contributions from everyone, and make sure that that is like those mechanisms are possible. And I don't know if that makes any implications on the size of the steering council, but just want to sort of like put that out as a thought of like, I see the steering council perhaps being responsible for helping sort of guide and make sure that like this conversation happens, but they don't necessarily have to be the ones who like create the SimPEG organization. Although I imagine that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Probably. I mean, I think a steering group is more to make sure that the long-term planning is being thought of, and to kind of keep tabs on what the current direction is like, are we veering off into something that is kind of beyond the core principles of what we've agreed SimPEG is? In which case it's the steering council's kind of role to say, you know, we think we're veering off now in this direction. Is this a direction we really should be taking, or do we need to kind of refocus? And then quite right, not to actually then do the refocusing, but just to say, this is the discussion we need to have. Will help facilitate this discussion around, is this the direction we're now moving in, or do we need to go back to our core principles? Those sorts of issues, just to make sure that the whole thing doesn't go off the rails. At a you know, it stays within the boundaries of what we've defined as what SimPEG is. And what it isn't.
So Craig, to kind of follow up on that, how would you imagine, or what are you thinking about from the point of view of having like everybody in the SimPEG community feel like they've got, some have potential for some input into actions that SimPEG would take, or how it's going to work, and at the same time them not really being on the the steering council. So some kind of intermediary, perhaps there's just some way that people can express their views and bring that to a larger visibility.
Yeah. So
how would you see that happening?
So what I think, I mean, maybe you could come up with, like, say, a yearly work plan. So say in the next 12 months, we're looking at, please contribute your thoughts as to what we'd like to work on in the next 12 months. Whether that's yourself, this is what I would like to work on to contribute, or actually I'd really like someone to do this bunch of work that I don't have the skills to do, but I can see a need for it. And then, so that gives everybody an opportunity to contribute. And then perhaps the steering council's role is to kind of just to have an overview of that work plan, say, yep, they all look fine, they're all within totally the scope of what SimPEG is, kind of go on, or say, actually, well, this one here, we need to think a little bit more about what it's actually trying to achieve, because it looks like it might be a little bit of a tangent that might be worth exploring. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we need to just have a bit more discussion around it. So like at the moment, it's fairly open slather, which is great. People contribute all sorts of stuff, but it's perhaps not in a very structured way, and there's perhaps no oversight of bigger implications. Does it fit with the core direction? Those sorts of things. So I think you can kind of have a, if you started to think of things as like a work plan, where like we're seeking contributions for what SimPEG's going to be developing, what's the roadmap for the next 12 months. And that's really good then, because it gives visibility for people coming in to say, this is what's happening, this is where we are now, but this is what we're working on in the next 12 months. And then the steering group has some kind of oversight of like, yep, these are all legitimate things for us to be investing our time on. Or if some of them need a bit more clarification as to what they're going to achieve, then there's an opportunity to go back and redefine that particular piece of work that someone's proposing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that kind of happens now with pull requests. It's kind of like, here's a bunch of stuff I've done. I'd like someone to review it and hope it gets in, but to kind of do that a little more in advance, to say, hey, I'm thinking of working, as part of my project now in the PhD, I'm going to be, in the next 12 months, I'm going to be focusing on this. I just want to put it out there that there'll be some pull requests coming 6 months down the track. Is this the right fit, or do I need to be tailoring it? Am I kind of heading left when everyone else is heading right, or is the way I'm working on this going to create problems when I come to make a pull request? Just those sorts of things. So it's not stopping anybody contributing, but it's kind of helping to make sure that those contributions are what are going to be really useful and be able to be integrated then in an efficient kind of a way.
Yeah, and it's also a great way for to be able to ask for financial support, right? Mm-hmm. For instance, right now, Nick really wants to see a CMT, right? Mm-hmm. And it's definitely on scope for us to have it implemented. Then you can turn around and say, look, Barrett, do you really want this to happen quickly? Then just forecast some money, and then we'll prioritize it for you, and then we'll make sure that you're up and running, right? And then here's a way to be able to advertise your services as an open source solution for industry or for whoever has like funding, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of model we work with here, is that we have an annual work plan. People can suggest items to it. You know, a little bit of what budget, what time's going to be required, and then there's kind of a selection process of, yep, these are all good, we can do that, or actually need to go away and think about that one a little bit more and bring it back.
I think this is then much more than what we talked in the beginning of a steering council in terms of a split up of BDFL that should not be used, and only if there is no decision within core devs, it has to decide, you know? Because like, let's say because you had the example earlier, the NumPy, SciPy model would be more, anyone can bring up in pull requests or on Slack ideas, and then any core dev would jump in and say, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea, domain specialist could wait in. And only if that doesn't resolve already and makes clear yes or no, then the steering council would have to decide, which is a very different responsibility than what you suggested, that there has to be a work plan for a year and decisions made anyway, which then would involve more work and more responsibility on the steering council. Is that right, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm used to working in a situation where there's a budget assigned at the start of the year and you need to wave the flag to get some money. So yeah, I guess then we don't want to be in a situation where you have to basically nominate all the work you're going to do at the start of the year and we can't accept any new work throughout the year. That wasn't the intent. But it's just to make sure that any work that does come in is going to contribute in the right way, and it's not going to unspool a whole bunch of problems further down the track when it comes to get merged. And so whether the core devs for that area feel comfortable enough to say, yep, that looks all good, or to say, actually, I need to take this upstairs for wider consultation on this. I guess that would be a judgment call of those people.
One of the pieces that I was written down as you guys were talking was it's sort of like what I see is the steering council is those additional pieces of coordination and focus that, if done well, then the individual contributions that are already happening and are already going on can be that force multiplier that Lindsay was talking about, and the steering council is actively looking for things that are already helping the community and just seeing if there's a connection that can be made, if it needs to shift by a month, hey, there's a conference coming up, we need to do some MT stuff, who's interested, like can we focus our efforts and like have some coordination around that work.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so I think it's trying to foresee issues or opportunities, like you say, Ryan. There's a big conference coming up that if we got a little bit extra work done, we could make a big contribution to and get a lot of visibility and from. Versus like, hey, I'm concerned there's a whole bunch of pull requests lined up that I think are a little bit off track. We need to have a bit more thought around those. And I guess it's just how that happens, and is it kind of an ad hoc thing that the steering group has a responsibility to kind of browse pull requests or browse the wider community and bring these opportunities or threats to people's attention, or is it, say, core devs responsibility to say, actually, there's some pull requests here I'm not happy with, or that we need to talk about a little more. Just how that happens on is it a formalized thing? Is it a ad hoc organic thing? Or
exactly, I was going to say it's kind of like managing, the balance between organic growth versus long-term goals. And then both can happen at the same time, but the steering committee should be responsible to always keep in mind the long-term goal, right? So this is pressing right now, but maybe it's not in line directly with our like 1 year or 2 year plan. So, yeah, you don't want to put pressure too much on the, or like push down too much on the organic growth, because that's when the exciting stuff is happening. But at the same time, we need like long-term vision, because otherwise we're just being super reactive to like what's happening next month because there is a conference and like
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the natural tendency, is to focus on, this is new and exciting, let's do it. And then the boring stuff of the core kind of gets neglected, and all of a sudden the documentation's out of date, people can't find examples, or all those sorts of things. It's that balance of bringing the cool new stuff in versus keeping the old boring stuff ticking over.
Yeah.
Not that it's boring.
Yeah, and one thing, and I think, Craig, to your point of sort of having a bit of a, coming up with a plan and caring about that plan and guiding the development of that. Again, it shouldn't just be like 3 or 5 people who develop that entirely, but if there is a group that's responsible for that and communicating that out to the community, it's much easier for somebody who's a core developer but maybe not on the steering council to say like, yep, like here's what I sort of benchmark against and understand as the long-term plan. If this is obviously tangential or obviously online, like I'm empowered to just make that decision. But if not, then that conversation can be elevated.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So I think the steering group can be responsible for setting what the long-term plan is, what the vision is.
Yeah.
And then making sure that the core people who are going to be basically approving pull requests are actually well educated with what that vision is and understand it themselves. And then there's a mechanism to actually go back and say, actually, I'm not sure, we need to think about this and have a discussion on a slightly wider level. And I think it helps also lay out to people who want to contribute. It's like, well, what is SimPEG aiming to be in the future? Because without that, people might be unsure of how they can contribute.
Mm-hmm.
If you can say, oh, SimPEG wants to go here, and I think I can help them get there, that's cool. But if it's kind of like, well, it seems this big amorphous thing, maybe I can contribute something, but I'm not quite sure how useful it will be, so maybe it's not worth my time. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and that framework for the vision is something that should be pretty upfront in our website or our landing page.
Yeah. Yep. Like, I'm not sure if SciPy or NumPy or any of those other, well, maybe not those packages, but next step down. Well, even those packages, whether they have what's the vision, what for this package, where is it? What is it doing? Where is it heading?
The vision, or some have a roadmap, at least, something like, what are the next projects we're going to tackle? I know Number has that.
Yep.
Someone have sound effects on.
Sorry, that's my pager on my phone going off. Should stop now.
Okay, so in terms of next steps, what I sort of am thinking, and again, feel free to chime in, is that perhaps it seems like the most important piece is to kind of flesh out like what the steering council is responsible for, what those roles kind of, well, what the steering council is responsible for. And then from there, kind of assess whether it should be 3 to 5, is because it does seem like, I mean, if it was just sort of the BDFL role, 3 people should be perhaps sufficient. if we're taking on something that's a bit bigger, then maybe we do want to think about 5 right out of the gate. But yeah, perhaps sort of like taking these notes that we've developed and sort of distilling a few of like, what are the high level responsibilities? Does that seem like the natural, important next step? Do folks have other opinions on?
I guess the one thing we haven't really talked very much about, and probably maybe don't want to expand on here, but is actually the role of the particular coordinators of each, whether it's PF or electromagnetics, just to kind of really outline a little bit more what those roles would be, because they, we've already talked about a lot of things being vetted through them before it even goes to the steering committee. So maybe, just looking at, again, the roles and the decisions that these people would play would be worthwhile.
Yeah.
So then, Doug, you kind of think going through this document, and instead of having kind of a general conceptual description of what each one of the roles is, try and come up with maybe a bit more explicit bullet points of what they would be doing day to day or in practice?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing would be perhaps useful. I was just trying to think of somehow flushing this out a little bit more to, kind of, well, for instance, we've got this community lead with documentation, right? Or we've got something else, but, just to try to, outline that a little bit more about what those responsibilities might be, and then just get a better sense of how that particular person kind of fits into the overall organization.
Yeah, actually, to that community lead documentation, I would want to split that up into 2 things. I mean, maybe one person wears both hats, but I don't think that interaction with the community is necessarily requiring you to be working on the documentation. Like, I think documentation and interacting with the community are 2 separate jobs.
Yeah, that's totally fair, Devin. And so maybe this is the wrong sort of precursor, is like these ones are all pretty clearly sort of scientific labels, but maybe this is a different name. But I completely agree that like those could be different labels as sort of somebody who's Q&A or sort of more this community liaison. Yeah, no, that's fair, Ron. It's just documentation lead.
Yeah. So maybe there's a few job descriptions to create, like you said, just to flesh out what the boundaries of these roles would be.
Yeah.
Is a good next step. Well, and is that are there any roles that are missed that should be included? And that might fall out once we start to think about what those proposed roles actually cover.
Yep.
Yeah.
So maybe to that point, one thing that I'll suggest, and see what you think of this, is actually if folks who are on the call right now would be willing to like basically write out like what is your job description in this organization, and like what would you like those sort of responsibilities to look like? What do they already kind of look like? What sorts of things would you perhaps be interested in taking on a bit more of? But kind of like thinking about your current activities in the SimPEG community and just like outlining what some of those are and what you feel is an important part of how you interact with the SimPEG community. Does that sound like a reasonable ask of folks? Does that sound like a useful thing to do?
Yeah, I think so. Yep. Because I mean, I think let's face it, the steering group and the other roles are probably going to be drawn out of the people who are here, plus a couple of others who perhaps aren't here. So if people start to say, oh, actually, I could see myself contributing to that role, and this is what I think it would be, then I think that's a good starting point. It might take I guess people might have to go away and think about it a little bit rather than nominate something right now on the spot. But you know, if like say next week or next meeting say, actually I'm keen to be involved in this aspect under this role, and a brief sketch of how it could be, what that would entail.
Yeah, and to that point, like feel free to add if there's a role you have in mind that doesn't have a title, even if you can't figure out necessarily what the title sort of looks like, feel free to just add those notes in here. I think it's most important to kind of get a sense of like, what are the styles of contribution, and then we can figure out the right like label and category for that.
Yeah, yep. Hey, I'm gonna have to go.
Okay, yes, no problem.
But yeah, good discussion. I think it's probably worthwhile keeping this as a fairly regular meeting if we want to kind of keep it ticking over, like a short regular meeting.
That sounds good. We can maybe try for one more next week if that works with folks, or are people going into Christmas mode? Want to also be respectful of that.
This time next week, I'm actually on leave.
Okay.
But the first 3 days of next week, I'm around.
Okay. Well, maybe what we can do is check in sort of asynchronously on Slack. What I will do is do we have a governance channel? If not, then we'll create one and sort of use that as a space to check in a bit more regularly on this and just kind of push things forward, especially with the holidays. I realize folks are going to take time, and but if you want to think through things on you know, during the break, then feel free to post stuff there. Cool. Okay, so 2 action items is we'll flesh out the steering council a bit more and flesh out sort of like what sorts of roles and contributions people want to be bringing to the table and are already bringing to the table.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll stop sharing here. And
there is now a Slack channel.
Excellent. Thanks to realizing.
Action item completed.
Wonderful. That's always a good way to end a meeting.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Lindsay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.